Sister banned our mom's new husband from her wedding so she could pretend that mom was with our abusive bio dad. When mom refused to come, sister asked me to lie to her eel. My sister, Kristen, just got married this week to her husband, Jacob. Naturally, you'd expect her to be floating on cloud 9, enjoying every moment of her newlywed bliss. But things haven't quite gone that way for Kristen. Rather than soaking in the excitement of this new chapter in her life, she has been blowing up my phone for the past few days. You see, Kristen had extended an invitation to our mom to be there on her big day. But there was one notable catch. Mom was not allowed to bring a +1. The context: our parents got divorced when we were pretty young, and ever since then, family dynamics have been tricky, to say the least. Growing up, my parents' marriage was nothing short of a nightmare. They fought constantly. As the oldest child, born just a year into their marriage, I had a front-row seat to all of it. I have witnessed both my mom and dad at their worst. Their arguments were intense, filled with anger and bitterness, and as young as I was, I understood that something was deeply wrong between them. Kristen, my younger sister, came along 4 years later, and by that time, I had already seen and heard far more than any child should have. Kristen, being the youngest, was naturally frightened by the chaos in our home. The shouting, the slamming doors, and the constant tension. It was a lot more terrifying for her, while I was more used to it. Hence, as her older sibling, I felt it was my job to protect her, even though I was still just a child myself. Whenever our parents would argue, I would try to shield her from the worst of it, distracting her with toys or stories, anything to take her mind off the screaming match going on in the next room. I remember holding her close whenever she'd get scared or nervous, telling her everything would be all right, even when I wasn't sure if it would be. As you can guess, I don't really like talking about this part of my life. It's painful, and honestly, I've tried to push a lot of those memories to the back of my mind. It wasn't just the verbal fights in our home that made it so unbearable. It was also how my dad would sometimes get violent, especially when he was drinking. I've lost count of the times I saw him hit my mom or use a belt on her, his anger completely out of control. He would lock her in the bathroom and refuse to let her come out until the early hours of the morning. Our mom, as much as she could, tried to protect us from it. When she knew he'd be coming home in one of his crazy moods, as she sometimes called it, she would wake me up and tell me to lock my bedroom door, to take care of Kristen and keep her safe. During those nights, even though I was scared too, I would try to stay strong for my sister. I'd hold her in my arms, praying that somehow this would all end and that our mom would be okay. Those nights felt endless, and they left such emotional scars that I don't think ever fully healed. However, one of the hardest things about living with my dad was how he could switch between being a monster one moment and pretending everything was fine the next. After a particularly violent, drunken night, he would wake up the next morning acting as if nothing had ever happened. He'd go about his day talking to us normally as though he hadn't been screaming, hitting, or locking my mom in the bathroom just hours earlier. It was maddening. And if my mom ever tried to confront him about his behavior, about the beatings, the yelling, or the way he treated her, he would act like he had no memory of it. He'd blame the alcohol or just flat out deny that anything had occurred, and give excuses like "I don't remember" or "I don't think I behaved that way." To make matters worse, if mom ever brought up divorce, he would then start following up with false promises. He'd swear up and down that he was going to change from that day forward. He'd promise that he was done drinking, that he would stop hurting her. But those words were hollow. It was all part of his manipulation. He never followed through on any of those promises. The cycle would just continue: another night of drinking, another outburst, another morning of denial. And for my mom, it must have been soul-crushing to hope, even for a moment, that maybe this time her husband was going to change, only to be let down again and again. If you're wondering whether my dad had some sort of mental disorder that made him act the way he did, I wish I could say yes, because that would have given us a way to understand his behavior, maybe even a bit of clarity or closure. But the truth is, he didn't have any diagnosable condition that we knew of. He wasn't suffering from anything that could explain the years of abuse. He was just a deeply narcissistic, manipulative person who seemed to take some sort of sick pleasure in causing pain, especially to my mom. It wasn't about mental illness, it was about control and cruelty. I think what finally made my mom leave dad, the moment that broke everything, was the day when he raised his hands on me. She had endured so much abuse herself, but when it came to us, her children, she had a limit. That limit was crossed when she had to attend her mother's funeral. She couldn't take us, me or Kristen, with her because we had school the next day, and she didn't want us to miss it. Before she left, she had talked to Dad repeatedly, pleading with him not to drink for just 2 nights while she would be away. It was her mother's funeral, after all, and she couldn't handle the added stress of worrying about us on top of everything else. My dad, of course, had no interest in attending the funeral with her. Begrudgingly, he agreed to stay home and take care of us. However, the very first night she was away, he came home drunk. I was asleep in my room when he stumbled in, reeking of alcohol, slurring his words. He started yelling at me, asking where Mom was, clearly too drunk to remember that she was at the funeral. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I tried to answer him calmly, my voice shaking. I told him that Mom was away at the funeral. But he was staggering around the room, knocking things over and kicking furniture, completely out of control. I was terrified that he would wake Kristen, who was sleeping next to me. So, in a shaky voice, I asked him if he could keep it down and get out of our room as he was starting to scare me. That apparently set him off. He exploded in a fit of rage, screaming at me for having the audacity to tell him what to do in his house and how he could talk as loud as he wanted. He kept ranting about how I had no respect for him, how I was just like my mom, defying him. I could see him losing control, and I knew where this was headed. I tried to calm him down, to de-escalate the situation, but it only made him angrier. He lashed out, and before I knew it, he slapped me hard across the face. I fell down on the floor, clutching my face. Kristen, who had woken up by now thanks to Dad's yelling, started to cry, clutching on to me in fear, her small body trembling. I was terrified too. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel my hands shaking, but I knew that if I didn't do something, if I just stayed frozen in that moment, things were only going to get worse. Dad was on the verge of completely losing control, and I couldn't let him hurt us or worse, hurt my sister. I made a split-second decision. Grabbing Kristen's hand, I pulled her along with me, running out of the house as fast as I could while Dad stumbled behind us, still yelling, his words slurring from the alcohol. My only thought was to get us somewhere safe, and I remembered what Mom had told me in moments like this: go to the neighbors. They were the only ones nearby, and we needed help, fast. I ran straight to their house, my heart racing, and started pounding on their door, ringing the doorbell over and over again. I must have looked like a mess, shaking, crying, desperate, but I didn't care. When they opened the door, they looked at us and already kind of knew that we needed help. They had heard my dad yelling at us before, seen glimpses of our chaotic home life, and had probably put the pieces together a long time ago. Without hesitation, they let us inside and immediately called 911. We also called my mom and asked her to come back home. She must have heard the panic in my voice because she promised right away that she would be on the next flight home. I felt a small sense of relief, knowing that help was finally on the way. Our neighbors reassured me that I did the right thing by getting away from Dad, as there was no guarantee of what he might have done to us in his drunken state. It was a night I'll never forget. When Mom came back and found out what had happened, she first hugged me and cried profusely for what had happened to me. She had endured years of abuse, but when it was directed at me, at her child, she couldn't take it anymore. It was like something inside her snapped. That was the moment she decided to leave him for good. After CPS was called, my mom had to step in to reassure them that both my sister and I would be staying with her from that point onward. My dad moved out with some of his belongings while my mom began the process of filing for divorce. Throughout this time, Mom would apologize to me over and over again, expressing her profound regret for not having left Dad sooner. I never really blamed my mom, but I know she still carries a lot of guilt for what happened. Despite all that Dad had done to us, true to his manipulative nature, he didn't simply just go away. He kept calling my mom repeatedly even after he had moved out and she had filed for divorce, insisting that she should reconsider leaving him. Sometimes he would even insist on speaking to me, where he would attempt to guilt-trip me for the whole thing. He'd say things like, "You're the reason this family broke up," and lay the blame squarely on me and Kristen for the way we ran out and called the police that night. As if it was our fault for wanting safety and peace, as if we were wrong for not wanting to live in that environment any longer. He would constantly insist that, even with the divorce, he was still our father and would forever be in our lives even if we didn't want to see him. I was terrified of the thought of ever being close to my dad again. I would pray every day to God that I never wanted to live with him again. Thankfully, when it came time for the courts to decide, the judge listened to us. They granted my mom full custody, which felt like a victory. Not only that, But they also issued a restraining order against my dad for the repeated instances of abuse he had subjected on us. This decision by the court changed our lives forever. It was a huge relief knowing that we were legally protected from him, and that he couldn't come near us anymore. For the first time in a long time, the three of us, Kristen, Mom, and me, had the space to heal away from the chaos and fear that had dominated our lives for so long. Of course, it wasn't all easy to live with Mom since she did have her own issues, but it was much better to live without Dad. During this time, my mom became deeply depressed. She had just gone through the devastating loss of her partner, my dad, and was still in the painful process of healing from the emotional and psychological scars left by the abuse she had endured. On top of that, she was also dealing with the added pressure of finding a job to support herself and her 2 children. It is a lot for anyone to handle, and watching her go through it all on her own was incredibly hard. Thankfully, there was a bit of relief for her because my dad was ordered to pay child support for both me and my sister, Kristen. At the very least, we knew we could rely on that money to help meet our basic needs, so that took one burden off my mom's shoulders. A few years after the divorce, my mom started dating Felix. He worked with her at the restaurant, and from the beginning, he was always there to help her out. He had asked her out multiple times, but she had always turned him down until she finally gave in. She came back from their first date beaming with excitement, and I knew that my mom was finally moving on. What stood out, though, was that Felix was significantly younger than my mom, and I think that made her feel a bit self-conscious. I remember asking her about him once, and she got visibly embarrassed. It was clear she felt people would judge her about the age difference. But from my perspective, I was just happy for her. I had seen her break down in tears so many times during her marriage to my dad, feeling trapped in a toxic and painful situation, that seeing her smile and have fun again was a huge relief for me. Throughout all of this, while I've always been supportive of my mom and her relationship with Felix, my sister Kristen has had a completely different reaction. In fact, she hates Felix with a passion, and it's not because he's ever done anything wrong to her. Her intense dislike stems more from the idea of our mom moving on and being with someone other than our dad. For some reason, Kristen has always held on to this twisted, almost idealized belief that our mom and dad were destined to be together, like they were soulmates or something. Despite everything that happened between them, she somehow expected that after a few years apart, they would eventually reconcile and get back together. I've thought a lot about why Kristen feels this way, and I honestly believe most of it comes from the influence of our dad. I blame him for planting these ideas in her head. Even though I haven't seen much of him over the years, Kristen continued to visit him from time to time after the divorce, whenever he would make some time for her. It wasn't a regular thing, but when she did see him, it seemed like he took those opportunities to manipulate her thinking. He would tell her that he was changing or improving himself for the sake of the family, and that he would eventually get back together with our mom. So every time Kristen came home after spending time with him, she'd be full of hope and dreams about how the 4 of us, me, Mom, and Dad, would one day be a family again. It was hard to hear her talk about it because, deep down, I knew it was never going to happen. I tried to reason with her, tried to explain that the relationship between Mom and Dad was over for a good reason, but she was completely convinced that our dad still loved Mom and that only he deserved to be with her. However, none of the fantasies Kristen clung to ever came true. As time went on and Felix became a bigger part of our mom's life, it became clear that Mom had moved on for good. I think that reality, seeing Mom happy with someone else, shattered the dream Kristen had been holding on to for so long. And that's where her grudge against Felix really stems from. In fact, 4 years ago, Felix and my mom finally got married. It's been amazing to witness the transformation in my mom's life, seeing her go from being in such a dark place to finding happiness and stability with someone who truly cares for her. Felix is a wonderful guy and has been there for me and my sister whenever we needed him. This year, when my sister Kristen got engaged to her college sweetheart, she shared with me that she planned on inviting our dad to her wedding. Hearing this really caught me off guard. I haven't seen or had any contact with our dad in a long time, and honestly, I've never understood why Kristen continues to have a relationship with him. He was abusive, both emotionally and physically, yet Kristen seems to have this inexplicable attachment to him. However, it was her wedding, and I knew it wasn't my place to dictate who she should or shouldn't invite, so I kept my thoughts to myself. But then something happened that really bothered me. When Kristen sent out the wedding invitations, she decided that our mom wasn't allowed to bring a +1. Mom called me after receiving her invitation, confused and upset, asking if I had been denied a +1 as well. I was shocked because, as far as I knew, Everyone else was allowed to bring a guest. Kristen knew full well that Felix was a significant part of our family. Now he wasn't just some casual boyfriend. He and Mom were married, so it was incredibly strange, even hurtful, that he hadn't even received an invitation, and worse, that Mom wasn't allowed to bring him as her guest. When Mom confronted Kristen about it, things quickly escalated. Kristen demanded that, for the sake of her wedding, she basically wanted Mom to play happy family with our dad in front of her future in-laws. Kristen didn't care that Mom was now married to Felix. In her mind, she saw her wedding as a chance to force this fantasy reunion of her mom and dad. Mom was absolutely stunned by this demand, and understandably, refused to go along with Kristen's condition. After all, how could she possibly pretend everything was fine with my dad, let alone play the role of his wife again after what he had put her through? It was an unfair and unrealistic expectation, and she was deeply hurt by it. I tried to step in and talk to Kristen myself, hoping to make her realize how unreasonable and hurtful her demands were. I wanted to remind her that Mom had every right to be happy and had moved forward with her life. But instead of listening, Kristen completely blew up on me as well. She lashed out, accusing me of never liking our dad and even blaming me for their separation. Hearing that accusation from her was devastating. As her older sibling, I had always been the one to protect her from Dad's abuse when we were growing up. I shielded her as much as I could from his anger, his manipulation, and his violence. Yet here she was, twisting the narrative, making me out to be the villain in her story. In the end, my mom made the difficult decision to stand her ground and refuse to attend Kristen's wedding. After everything that had happened, the arguments, the unreasonable demands, and the emotional strain, Mom knew she couldn't pretend to play the role Kristen wanted her to, especially not when it meant disrespecting her own marriage to Felix. As for my dad, he did attend the wedding, but it was far from a pleasant experience. The moment he arrived, I could tell he was already drunk. He reeked of alcohol, and his behavior was erratic, just like I had expected him to be. I made it a point to stay as far away from him as possible and didn't even make eye contact with him the entire time. It was hard enough being in the same room with him, and I just couldn't bear the thought of interacting with him. Things got worse when it came time for the speeches. Dad was expected to say a few words to congratulate the couple, but instead of delivering a heartfelt message, he ended up slurring his way through the speech because of the multiple glasses of whiskey he already had. It was embarrassing to watch, and I could see the discomfort on people's faces. Clearly, inviting Dad to the wedding had been a huge mistake. Other than him, the wedding itself was fine overall. Now, after the wedding, the situation with Kristen's in-laws has grown complicated. They have started asking questions about our family, especially about why Mom didn't show up for her wedding. Since they have met Mom before and have seen how she is always so supportive of her children, I guess they are starting to suspect that Kristen might have done or said something. Instead of being upfront with them, Kristen has started spinning a narrative painting Mom in a bad light. She has been telling her husband's relatives that Mom was uninterested in attending the wedding and that despite multiple pleas, Mom didn't care much to attend. Obviously, this is a big, fat lie, but what makes this worse is Kristen has now asked me to get involved. She's planning a lunch with her in-laws after she returns from her honeymoon, and she wants me to be there to back her up in front of them. Basically, she's expecting me to support her version of events and help her convince the in-laws that Mom's absence was something inexplicable, as if she had no real reason for not attending. Kristen doesn't want them to know the real story, that she had placed unfair demands on Mom, which led to the fallout. Instead, she's looking for me to cover for her and keep the blame away from her. This is why I am on Reddit today. On one hand, Kristen's my sister, and I want to support her, especially now that she's starting a new chapter in her life. But on the other hand, lying to cover up the truth only prolongs the problem and will only get messier if we keep pretending. Kristen's in-laws deserve to know the real story if they're asking, and I'm not sure I can be part of a charade that makes Mom look bad just so Kristen can avoid taking the blame. Ida, if I refuse to go along with my sister's lies? Update 1. My sister Kristen has always been embarrassed about our mom's relationship with Felix. Felix is 6 years younger than Mom, which honestly isn't a huge gap. But for some reason, Kristen thinks this is something inappropriate and believes that Mom shouldn't have married a younger man. Also, the truth is that Kristen has never really told her in-laws that Mom and Felix are married. Yes, her husband, Jacob, knows, but not the rest of the family. Mom and Felix had a simple court wedding with no big ceremony or celebration. They've never posted pictures or made a big deal out of it, which has allowed Kristen to always pretend that Felix isn't a permanent part of Mom's life. Kristen has even gone so far as to repeatedly ask Mom not to mention her marriage to Felix to any of her friends or her in-laws, telling her how embarrassed and awkward she feels by it. Mom, being as patient and understanding as she always is, used to agree to Kristen's requests for a long time. She never pushed back and kept Felix in the background whenever Kristen asked, respecting her feelings even though it wasn't fair since she believed that Kristen would eventually grow up. However, things changed when Kristen didn't allow Felix to attend her wedding. I guess that was the breaking point for Mom. She had already compromised so much to accommodate Kristen's discomfort, but this request crossed the line. After years of adjusting herself to make Kristen feel comfortable, Mom finally put her foot down. She had reached her limit, and I don't blame her at all for standing up for herself. As for my dad, I've long come to the conclusion that he never truly loved anyone except himself. If he had really loved Mom, there's no way he would have put her through the kind of abuse that he did. Part of the reason Kristen is so stuck on the idea of seeing our parents reunite is that she doesn't really remember the full extent of the abuse Dad inflicted on us. He was younger than me when it all happened, and her memories are fragmented. Mom has always asked me not to bring up the past with Kristen, to spare her from the painful details of what we endured. Because of this, she remembers only bits and pieces of the toxic environment, hence she is able to downplay the seriousness of what we went through. Update 2. Thanks everyone for all your advice. I showed the post and comments to Mom, and she finally agreed to sit down and talk to Kristen this week about everything. Long story short, Mom showed Kristen the hospital records and the divorce filings, and told her in detail about the abuse she received at the hands of my father. Kristen, who had vehemently refused to accept the truth for so long, was left speechless. I could see in her face that this shattered the illusion she had held on to for years. For so long, she had convinced herself that our family's problems weren't that serious, that maybe Mom and Dad just had a few rough patches. But now, confronted with hard evidence, she couldn't deny what had happened. However, Kristen still tried to argue by claiming that maybe Dad had changed after the divorce and maybe he wasn't the same person he used to be. She urged Mom to give him another chance by at least being friends with him. But at that point, both Mom and I were firm with her. We told her that if she truly believed that Dad had changed and wanted to keep glorifying him in front of us, knowing everything we had suffered, then maybe it was time for us to take a break from each other. It wasn't an ultimatum, but it was a boundary. We were tired of hearing Kristen idolize Dad. This deeply offended Kristen. She wasn't expecting us to be so direct, and has asked for some time to think about everything. I understand why she is hurt, but I also think she needs to hear it. It's not that I want her to stop talking to Dad. She's entitled to her own relationship with him. However, what I do want is for her to stop worshiping him and let go of her unrealistic expectation of reuniting the family. Update 3. So, it's been 4 months since my last update. Eventually, Kristen came clean to her in-laws about the real reason why Mom didn't attend her wedding. I think after learning the full extent of the truth, she realized that hiding it and blaming Mom wasn't just unfair, it was damaging to their relationship. It must have been hard for her to admit the truth, but she did it anyway. Once her in-laws understood the reality of what our family had been through, they were much more understanding about Mom's absence. Since then, Kristen has taken a huge step forward by also apologizing to Mom. Mom, in her usual way, was gracious and willing to forgive. She also took the initiative to speak with Kristen's in-laws, smoothing things over and clarifying any misunderstandings. For now, Kristen has gone low contact with Dad. It has been such a relief to see this whole messy situation finally settle down.